Is Vladimir Putin winning? The Russian president's annexation of Crimea looks pretty irreversible, with Ukrainian forces having failed to eject Russian forces from their territory. In Syria, the Russian air forces helped President Assad turn the tide in that civil war, retaking key cities from the rebels in the process. And then there's the US. New President Donald Trump heaped praise on Putin in the past. So, has the former KGB chief and chess fan outplayed and outmaneuvered his opponents at home and abroad? Joining me to debate this are Alexander Nekrassov, Russian journalist, commentator and former Kremlin advisor, and Ilya Ponomarev, former member of the Russian parliament, the Duma, strong critic of Vladimir Putin, who now lives in self-imposed exile in Ukraine. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Ilya, let me start with you. From Syria to Ukraine to the EU to US domestic politics, it looks like Vladimir Putin has the upper hand on the international stage, strategically, militarily, geopolitically. Is that a fair assessment?
No, I think that's an exaggeration. He's a player, for sure, and he is a way stronger player than his opponents. He has a certain way to approach things, and he manifests himself very nicely. So by having all the propaganda tools at hand, like Russia Today, like different internet media, he made this appearance. But the question is whether Russian people are living better than they were previously. No. We are now enemies with our closest allies, Ukraine, with our brother nation of Ukrainians, with our closest relatives, and we are world pariah. So is this a win? I doubt.
Alexander Nekrassov, it's an exaggeration and propaganda to say Putin is doing well on the international stage right now.
Well, in my opinion, I think Putin is simply using the lack of any initiative on the part of the Western governments, on the part of the EU, and obviously the absolutely disastrous foreign policy of Obama. And that is why in Syria, for example, he simply used this situation to his benefit, and that's how it all developed. I don't really see any specific foreign policy which Putin pursues all over the world, and to say that he is winning, I'd rather say the West is losing than Putin is winning.
Just to deal with the elephant in the room, did Putin, in your view, want Donald Trump to win? Was a Donald Trump victory in November a victory for Vladimir Putin, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, in the Kremlin, they wanted a candidate who spoke of Russia well. Under Obama, it was an absolute disaster for Russia. I don't even understand, when people are saying, well, the Kremlin wanted, Trump to win. Excuse me, why shouldn't it want Trump to win if Trump was saying good things about Russia, saying that we should change the policy? Are you telling me that they should have wanted Hillary to win, who was basically opposed to Russia, who was threatening Russia? So I don't understand this logic.
Do you think he wanted Trump to win?
I don't think so. I think that he actually wanted him to lose, but to lose on a narrow margin to sparkle a protest inside the United States. And I think that the strategy was to deal with Secretary Clinton because it was predictable, it was a known person. There is a long history of relations with Clinton. There is a long history of relations with her husband. There is a history of donations that were passed from Russia into Clinton Foundation. So it's a very convenient president to deal with. Right now, we have a totally unpredictable person in the White House which surrounded himself with hawkish people, and we don't know what they're going to do. Is this a scenario that any sensible leader would want?
But they're also talking about dropping sanctions on Russia. Which would upset all of America's Western allies, the EU, which has been trying to mount a united front in terms of sanctions.
Look, the sanctions, we should understand what they are. There is two parts of sanctions. There are so-called personal sanctions, which are put on individuals, and nobody is talking about dropping them. And there are sanctions which are put on the economy, on doing business with the country. And for example, my position from the very beginning was that economic sanctions, they are totally unnecessary and even harmful, because we are cutting actually the ties. Doing business with the West is actually the way to influence Russian society.
Alexander Nekrassov, there is this argument amongst some quote-unquote hawks in the West that now you have a President Trump who seems to be soft on Putin in some ways, that Putin will now feel emboldened, energized. If you're living in one of the Baltic republics, you might feel a little bit worried that Russian tanks are more likely to come across your border rather than less likely.
Well, first of all, nobody's going to attack the Baltics simply because they are members of NATO. So it would be madness for any leader of any country, by the way, not just Russia, to attack a member of NATO. So I don't even understand where this comes from.
Let me ask this question to Ilya. You wrote in 2015 that Russia in 2015 is like the Germany of 1933. That's over the top, isn't it? For all his sins, Vladimir Putin isn't Hitler and Russia today isn't Nazi Germany.
No, of course, Vladimir Putin is not Hitler. He is just a kleptocrat and not a bloody dictator as Hitler was. But in terms of what he is building inside the country, it reminds me very much of that period in Germany. And if you remember the history, when it all started in 1933, that was all about restoration of national economy, about modernization, about national dignity, and nobody was envisioning war. Even in 1939, the close members of Hitler's surrounding, they were not expecting the World War to emerge. And they were taken by surprise with the invasion into Poland and the scale of the problem.
When the Russians went into Crimea and annexed Crimea, you were the only MP, the only member of the Duma who voted against it. I think the vote was 445 to 1.
Yes.
What happened to you after that vote? How did you end up leaving Russia?
Well, then it was a criminal case opened against me, and it was done in the way when I was traveling internationally on the business of my home constituency in Siberia, whom I represent, and I needed to bring investments and technologies into. It was bridge construction. So
you believe you were targeted for voting against the government voting?
Yeah, of course. I was told directly that they will not allow me to come back and to repeat what I have done in future, because at that time it was discussion about the application of military force in Ukraine, and they didn't want anybody to stand openly against it inside the country.
And do you fear for your life now? You live in Kiev. I mean, do you not return because you're worried about being arrested or worried about something worse happening to you?
Well, look, unfortunately, we see examples of some of other members of Russian opposition being murdered and attacked and harassed and whatever. But, you know, that happens, and there is nothing I can do to protect myself against it.
Let me put that point to Alexander. Alexander, isn't it the case that Putin is only, quote-unquote, doing well, a strong leader, because he's running an authoritarian state where he cracks down on dissent, cracks down on critics, cracks down on human rights groups? Isn't that the case?
First of all, I need to tell you this. Putin has to have a strong hand, because you can't run Russia being a weak leader. We have a big problem, just like in Ukraine, by the way. We have those groups of oligarchs who are trying to do whatever the hell they want, who are trying to influence politics, the economy, and so on. One of these oligarchs was Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He practically bought half of parliament and tried to even pull off a coup. So Putin has to be strong in order to keep the country together. So I don't understand
his own oligarchs in replacement.
This idea,
you know, right now the current oligarchs
this idea of
around
saying,
Putin are way stronger than the old oligarchs of 90s.
Alexander, he has his own oligarchs, Ilya.
The oligarchs, these groups, are fighting with each other. They're causing a lot of grief in the economy. They're causing a lot of grief that are still siphoning money out of Russia and so on. And by the way, if you, Ilya, want to see how oligarchs behave, look at Ukraine. Look what they're doing there. The same people who've been ripping off Ukraine, pillaging it, they're still there, they're still doing it, and Petro Poroshenko can't do anything about
Alexander,
it. Because he's not a strong
I'm very glad
leader.
that he actually brought it, because I think that the nature of regime in Ukraine, the social base of regime in Ukraine and the regime in Russia is exactly the same. It's a union between right-wing nationalists and neoliberals. Neoliberals who are running the economy and nationalists who is the base.
Ilya, does it undermine your credibility as a Putin critic that you chose to live in Ukraine? And so a lot of your fellow Russians, former colleagues, are saying, see, you're against our country.
The difference is very simple, that Ukrainians made a free choice of electing this power. And there is democracy in Ukraine.
And they didn't make a free choice in Russia.
And there is free media. There is nothing like that in Russia. It's very simple.
Let's be clear, Alexander, do you support democracy in Russia? Because you implied earlier that democracy is not the right thing for Russia.
No, excuse me. I'm always telling this to Western commentators and politicians. Russia is still in the transition stage. It had the most horrible dictatorship for more than 70 years. We've lost about 60 or 70 million people, some of the best, by the way, people. We had economy mismanaged on a scale unheard of in history. And you want this country to suddenly become all democratic, all nice, all wonderful.
That's actually exactly the point. Russia is transiting in the opposite direction. Ukraine is transiting in the right direction. Right now, in just last 2 years, Russia has lost 1.5 million people because they fled the country, because they don't want to stay. And that's the most economically active people, the most dynamic people, the most liberally thinking people.
Alexander, how successful is Putin really when his people are suffering in many ways? You talk about the economy. The Russian economy experienced no growth for 6 straight quarters. Real wages until very recently were falling. Poverty has been on the increase. Putin and his allies, the oligarchs, might be winning, but ordinary Russians aren't, are they?
Well, again, you know, I started to say this. Ordinary people are living badly in all countries of the world. Look at Greece, look at Portugal, look at Italy collapsing, look at Spain and so on.
When Putin was coming to power in the year 2000, he actually said that he wants to catch up on Portugal. Right now, he abandoned into even this modest goal because it's not working. He cannot.
Alexander.
Ilya, all these GDP figures mean nothing. You know, it's absolutely useless to start comparing those GDP.
Or you're following this pattern of alternative facts. These are facts.
No, they stand for nothing.
Ilya, let me ask you this question. Isn't the problem for you that, yes, Russian people are suffering economically, yes, there's crackdown on human rights and dissent and public protests, etc., and yet even independent polling in Russia shows Putin is still very popular. He has the command of he commands the support of many, many Russians. Isn't that a problem for people like you?
No, of course it is a problem, but we should understand the source of this problem. And the source of this problem is very simple, because Putin is alone. Because he does not allow anybody who can challenge him, not even like to run on the elections, but even to get access to media. That's why people simply don't know any of the alternatives.
You don't think it's because Russians like a strong leader, need a strong leader, as Alexander said earlier?
Of course, traditionally Russians like strong leader to be in power. And I have nothing against of strong leader to be in power. But strong doesn't mean corrupt. Strong doesn't mean dictator. Strong doesn't mean mean. Strong can be a good person. And it can be democratically elected, and it can be a people's man, not like it is today. Because today we have a person represented by oligarchy. We have a person who represents siloviki. We have a person who represents bureaucracy.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.